Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Stablecoin Solutions Show, the first and only show on X dedicated to talking about all things stablecoins. And as always, there's a lot to talk about. I want to go ahead and share the space real quick so we can get some people on board before we jump into the conversation. So give me a second while I multitask here. Let's see. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. And I hope that obviously going into the weekend, you all have a great weekend. We are live. All right. So let's jump into the conversation. Lots of interesting things happening in the space. I want to open up with a piece that was put out yesterday by great crypto reporter in the space, Eleanor Terrett. Eleanor Terrett has basically, in my opinion, confirmed what I have been saying for weeks about what is going on with the Clarity Act, and I'm not surprised. So here it is. According to Politico, Senator Tillis has come out and said that he wanted to initially release the draft of the Clarity Act with respect to this provision on stablecoin yield. And he wanted to get that out and live for a markup this week. Well, apparently that's been pushed. And according to Eleanor's reporting, the idea, it appears, is to avoid putting the text under too much scrutiny before a markup date is on the calendar, which could create more runway for problems. So I've been saying, why in the world is the Senate taking so long to publicly release the draft language for what the compromise is on the Clarity Act when it comes to stablecoin yield? That is something that directly impacts consumers. And I've been maintaining that the legislative process should be far more transparent and consumers should have an opportunity to see what the hell is in this thing before it gets jammed down our throat with a congressional vote. So now the deal is that apparently they're going to release this draft language, I think, next week, most likely on the heels of a floor vote on the Clarity Act. Everyone's publicly talking about the fact that the Clarity Act is close to being passed. Key senators said Thursday that they may wait until next week or beyond to release an agreement aimed at resolving lobbying clashes between the cryptocurrency firms and the banks that is key to advancing this landmark digital asset bill. So again, there's all kinds of backdoor conversations being had about the markup on the Clarity Act. The bank lobby has been pushing tirelessly with their scare tactics to try and limit what consumers have as far as options to earn interest on their money, because they are terrified that digital dollars, fully regulated digital dollars under the Stablecoin Genius Act, will give consumers an alternative to the paltry, terrible interest that banks pay to consumers for holding their money. They don't like that Coinbase is offering this yield program through their Circle arrangement to consumers where they're getting 4 to 5% yield on their digital dollars because they are scared that it will impact their monopoly on how people hold, custody, and move money and how consumers can earn interest on that money. The other side of the coin, and I've been very, very candid about this, is that big firms like Coinbase obviously have a vested interest in this conversation because they've made a great deal of money in offering consumers yield over Circle on their platform, and they certainly don't want to lose that competitive advantage over the banks. The banks don't want Coinbase to act like a bank unless they are a fully regulated bank. Cryptocurrency firms don't want to be fully regulated banks. They want to be neobanks because we're here to modernize all this stuff. One interesting thing that Scott Bessent came out with this week, which kind of reaffirms that this is where it's all going, and that I think at the end of the day, the banks are ultimately doomed in this desperate grasp on their legacy way of doing things, His Besant made it clear that at Bretton Woods, we created the modern banking system, and, it's probably due for a reset. And I can't disagree with that. It is due for a reset. I've talked about it extensively in my book, Make Your Wallet Your Bank. It is available. The link is my pinned tweet in my profile. If you want to download Make Your Wallet Your Bank, it's free. It'll just cost you an email address, and it gives you the playbook for how you can bypass the banking system and its toll booth economy and its fee extractive economy. You can spend in stables and avoid, both as a merchant and a consumer, those extractive fees, and then you can arbitrage the savings that you realize over fully regulated stablecoins by way of a two-asset strategy. I happen to be a big proponent of Bitcoin as the second part of that. So my thesis is spend in stables, take the savings when you get out of the bank's extractive fee model, and use stablecoins to stack in sats and protect yourself by making your wallet your bank. That's the general thesis. So I'll continue to monitor what's going on with this, but it's just, to me, what Eleanor has posted today with respect to this revised playbook from Senator Tillis, that he wants to delay publicly releasing this draft language, reaffirms what I've been saying daily for weeks. The consumer's been locked out of the backdoor conversation between the banks and the crypto sector. The consumer has had no meaningful participation in what is going to directly impact them, which is the ability to earn interest on their own money. This is the most significant piece of crypto legislation we've had to date. And the fact that the consumer is not a seat or a party to this in any significant way, and that legislators continue to hide from the consumer what's in this markup bill because they're afraid it'll get too much scrutiny and that could derail their runway for getting this thing done, is laughable and just shows how completely broken our current legislative model is, that you have people that are elected officials that should be beholden to the public, to the consumers that they serve, but instead their loyalty is to the bank lobbies and the crypto lobby, and that they would prefer to give them a seat at the table and to essentially freeze the consumer out of the conversation and not give the consumer any access to what's in this bill until it is jammed down your throat in a floor vote. So I'm going to call them out every step of the way on this, and I'll continue to be vocal and critical about this because I don't care. I'm here because I believe that there's a better way for consumers, and I'm not going to stop talking about that. And unfortunately, for some reason, the mainstream press has just not picked up on this, that the consumer is essentially locked out of this system. And that's very troubling. It's very troubling for the way the legislative process works. It's very troubling for the way the backdoor lobbying and deal making works. And while I think the crypto sector has a lot of great actors in it who do believe in protecting the consumer, I think they should be demanding that the consumer see what the hell's in this bill. I don't understand why we have to keep this thing behind closed doors, but I digress. Another piece that I've been covering is actually pretty interesting. I wrote a piece this week which talked about this recent drama that's been going on in the space with respect to the freezing of stablecoins. There was a big controversy with respect to a piece that one of the great blockchain sleuths in our space, Zach XBT, put out, where he broke down the drift hack and gave a very methodical breakdown of how his on-chain investigation documented 15 specific incidents since 2022, in which he argues that Circle, the largest U.S. stablecoin issuer, failed to act despite having the technical ability to do so to freeze what he believes were fraudulent transfers. And I wrote a piece which kind of talked about the fact that, Circle is doing this because, or is not doing this, is not immediately executing this because of the legal consequences that come for Circle without court cover or some kind of court order. Jeremy Allaire came out publicly and talked about this and said, quote, "Circle has a very clear performance obligation under the law. Circle follows the rule of law, and were able to undertake actions such as freezing a wallet at the direction of law enforcement or the courts. So while Zach XBT would like to see instant real-time on-chain freezing of suspicious activity or fraud in order to protect the victims, and look, he's worked tirelessly to expose crypto fraud in the space, and I respect the work he's done. There's one nuance in this that I think needs to be reinforced, and that the Genius Act is essentially a roadmap for how digital dollars move. And part of that roadmap, part of what went into this process is that it basically has to mirror the same block and freeze mechanisms that we see in the current financial system when it applies to banks. Banks cannot sua sponte on their own. That's fancy legal Latin jargon. But banks can't just freeze on suspicious activity without some directive. There are ways under the Bank Secrecy Act, under OFAC with sanctioned nations, and under suspicious activity reports that these mechanisms can be implemented by banks. And I talk about that in the article. The article is in my profile if you want to take a look at it. But the premise of what I'm saying is that people are essentially not understanding the exact mechanisms that Circle is obligated legally to work under, which is very similar to what banks work under. Banks cannot unilaterally freeze accounts the moment they suspect there is third-party fraud. They have certain narrow mechanisms they can act upon, which is AML compliance flags, OFAC triggers, the things I just talked about. The IRS can levy a bank account without a court filing, but that requires proper notice and a waiting period. The FBI, the U.S. Secret Service, they can all compel a freeze through an administrative demand that they send to a bank or an asset forfeiture hold. But then you have an element of due process in that system where people have an opportunity to be heard and respond to that notice of asset forfeiture. And then finally, the last mechanism is the court judgment. Now, since I wrote that piece, this has all kind of come to a head because we have now a new development. A lawsuit, a class action lawsuit has been filed by a victim in the drift exploit, as well as 100 other affected investors. They dropped this lawsuit, I believe, on April 14th, 2026. The lawsuit basically goes back to the April 1st, $285 million digital asset drift protocol exploit. It's attributed to North Korean linked Lazarus Group hackers, and it suggests that Circle failed to intervene and freeze those assets and protect those consumers that were affected under the drift exploit, and that this occurred over several hours, 6 to 8 hours, access to 100 transactions, during which Circle had the technical ability, the contractual authority, and the operational precedent to freeze and blacklist the relevant USDC addresses that were connected to this hack, I should say, and that they were negligent in failing to do that and failing to protect consumers. So the consumers in this class action lawsuit are seeking damages. They're seeking a remedy for this. Now, while I understand where the lawsuit's coming from, again, I understand that there should be better mechanisms in place. Even the instances that are cited in the lawsuit where Circle has previously executed freezes, it's worth stressing that those were freezes based on court orders, as I understand it. So again, this takes us back to the same problem. Circle and its lawyers are not going to expose Circle to potential legal ramifications or retaliation from people who believe that their wallets were wrongly frozen without due process. Circle, while it has the technical abilities to do this, and while under the Genius Act, they are required, all stablecoin issuers are required to have effective seize, freeze, and burn mechanisms in place to help in preventing this type of behavior, there still has to be the legal component, the legal cover. And without that legal cover, Circle is exposing itself to liability. So my prediction is this lawsuit will probably not prevail, but it does open up an interesting conversation, and it's kind of the closing part of the article that I wrote. The answer is right. What XBT is proposing, what this lawsuit's suggesting, is we should have better, more robust ways waiting for a court order as the trigger mechanism for on-chain activity, which happens instantly with instant finality, is not the ideal scenario here. So what I think will come out on the other side of this is we'll probably have to see some kind of hybrid approach where you have much more nimble judicial and administrative processes in place that can effectuate these freezes, because I get both sides of the conversation here. Waiting for the courts to hash this out in the traditional way does not work in the new world of blockchain speed, high latency movement, and lack of finality. So yes, these wallets can be frozen. These transactions can be flagged. There is a mechanism in place that Circle and any other Genius Coin issuer, stablecoin issuer under the Genius Act has. However, what needs to probably evolve at this point is the legal mechanism to get from court order or administrative order to a freezing mechanism in a much faster fashion. And I think that Zach XBT's expose, I think that this lawsuit, and I think Alair's own comments will probably drive some kind of innovation in that direction. That doesn't help the people who were victimized in the drift exploit, of course, and that is unfortunate, but that is the way it works in the law. You can't do things outside the limits of the law without exposing yourself to liability, and Circle's lawyers are very well aware of that, I'm sure, and they've advised them in that way. So this one is another one which we'll just have to kind of continue to monitor. Third thing I want to talk about in today's episode is a piece that I just put out today. This one is interesting from the perspective of there was an interview by Bloomberg in which Hank Paulson sat with David Weston at Bloomberg Television's Wall Street Week and basically sounded the alarm bell that the Treasury needs to come up with some kind of, quote, break the glass, end quote, plan and have it ready to deploy off the shelf in the event that we see a massive dry up in demand for U.S. Treasuries. That prompted me to put out my piece, which says that what Paulson wants, which is this break the glass plan, I think Scott Bessent, the sitting Treasury Secretary, has already implemented. For those of you who don't recall who Paulson is, he presided over the 2008 financial crisis. He was able to, through liquidity and through the measures that the Treasury implemented, to ease the landing, so to speak, bail out the banks, and fix the major financial crisis. But he fears that we may not have that tool available in the next crisis because we are so, at this point, over-leveraged with respect to the U.S. deficit and debt and the continued debasement of currency. So in my piece, I basically make the case that Paulson is right. We're running $39 trillion deficit. It's uncontrollable. The interest on that deficit is out of control. It does definitely impact Treasury demand. And if the Treasury, as he suggests, ends up being the last buyer of resort for U.S. Treasuries, well, that creates a big problem. And we don't want a repeat of what happened in 2008 with a massive financial crisis. But I suggest in this piece that Bessent, and I think Bessent is probably a big architect of the Genius Act, he saw this coming. And this kind of ties back to a previous piece that I had put out talking about the third act for the dollar. For those of you who haven't seen that one, that's also gotten a lot of traction in my profile. And this new article is also available on my X feed if you want to check it out. But basically, I broke down the three acts of the dollar. Act one being the Bretton Woods Accord, where we went on the gold standard. That bought the dollar a lot of Treasury demand globally. We went off the gold standard in the 70s with Nixon and pivoted to the petrodollar system. What's happening in Iran right now and the total unraveling of that petrodollar system definitely threatens the continued marketplace globally for U.S. treasuries. And we're already starting to see reduced demand for U.S. treasuries. So my thesis is that what Paulson is proposing with this break glass in case of emergency measure, Bessent's already got the playbook in place. And that playbook essentially is create dollar demand for treasuries around the world through stablecoins. It replaces the current petrodollar system. It's a hedge against the lack of nation state interest in treasuries, because every single Genius Act compliant stablecoin that is issued anywhere around the world and goes into a digital wallet has to have a corresponding treasury asset in reserve. So what you replace with this break glass in case of emergency mechanism is you set up a system where in the event that treasuries do start to see a decline, and in the event that the Fed and the government are the only last resort buyer for treasuries, and let's be real, we're kind of already seeing this happen right now, albeit this was a planned move. We just saw a $15 billion shore up in liquidity through the Fed matching their last biggest buy of treasuries. So the Fed's already buying treasuries at massive tranches. And that was, of course, I think part of the playbook and pre-planned, but it just continues to reinforce that this is not going away. I've been very vocal that the dollar, if successfully executed through the Genius Act, can generate an additional flywheel. And let me kind of expand on how that works. So we talked about the fact that every overseas purchaser of a stable coin and depositor of a stable coin into their digital wallet will trigger a demand for a U.S. Treasury. So every time a stable coin is born, a Treasury gets its wings. That's great. The reason that I think this is a big potential flywheel, which might buy the dollar a little bit longer runway, but again, I still maintain at the current rate that we're printing and debasing, the dollar is on a course where it's probably not going to be sustainable. And that's where Bitcoin comes in the event that that happens. But in any event, we exist in a dollar world right now, and the dollar is king. Bessent wants to maintain that status. He's the biggest cheerleader for treasuries in the dollar. So his thesis is that there are a lot of countries around the world that want access to dollars, be it debanked countries or countries with very volatile currencies. And it's hard for people in these countries to get access to dollars because of the exchange rate, because of the corruption within their own banking system. And people pay a huge premium to hold dollars around the world. The dollar is the predominant vehicle in places like South America. It's very much sought after, but it comes at a real cost. What stablecoins under the Genius Act enable is they enable anyone around the world without the need to have to go through those intermediary banks in their own country and go through traditional fiat dollar rails to get access to dollars. They can get digital dollars and they can get them in their wallet directly, and they can spend them directly without the need to go through banks and FX conversion rates and the extortive practices that happen in a lot of countries where people pay a huge premium in legitimate markets and even in not so legitimate markets to get dollars. Well, this negates all that because now they can get those digital dollars through the Genius Act directly into their wallet, which creates not only a flywheel for treasury demand, but it also creates a flywheel for blockchain integration and adoption, because once people get more comfortable with putting digital dollars in their wallets, they're inevitably going to discover things like Bitcoin. And that whole thesis that I've been talking about, and that is the basis for my book, Make Your Wallet Your Bank, is that by spending in stables and understanding how digital dollars work as an alternative to the banking system, and if you want to download that again, that's in my profile, pinned tweet. But what that does is it gives the consumer access to blockchain technology, wallet technology, and they understand how easy it is on their own without the toll booth economy of banks to move money around. Well, that's going to translate globally now, because now you're going to have people all over the world who are going to have access to the same exact stablecoin infrastructure. And if they can then realize that, hey, I can move digital dollars so easily without the reliance on banks or my own native currency, then I can now bridge those digital dollars into other cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, whatever your secondary asset strategy is. The fact remains, when people get more comfortable with digital dollars in their wallet, they're inevitably going to adopt the other cryptocurrencies that exist, and that's going to create greater adoption and greater traction for all of this, because the playbook is very clear. Everything is going digital, including our money. You drop into the conversation AI agents paying each other with digital dollars, and you're going to see a huge increase in demand for blockchain technology, and digital dollars will be the rails. This ties back into my original point that this whole mess with the Stablecoin Genius Act, Clarity Act, yield thing, and not seeing what's in the bill is all because the banks are freaking out that they're going to lose that stranglehold. Now, going back to my original piece that I talked about that I put out today, with respect to Besson has already come up with the solution to this break glass urgency that Paulson is talking about. That's the Genius Act. Because under the Genius Act, if he pulls this off, if he gets away from the petrodollar system, which I think at this point it's pretty clear that China is breaking away from buying oil in dollars. Most of the Gulf states are realizing that the dollar petrodollar system is probably not going to give them the security that they wanted in that region. And a lot of longstanding relationships are falling apart over there. So the dollar has to find a new demand mechanism globally to stay relevant. And Besant knows that. And I think Besant worked well in advance of this collapse that could come to the petrodollar system in being the architect of this Genius Act strategy. So the break glass measure is exactly that. If you have foreigners who can easily get access to digital dollars, and every digital dollar they put in their wallet has to be backed by a treasury equivalent asset, well, you just created a whole new demand mechanism for treasuries, which I think could fill this very void and would alleviate against the treasury being the buyer of last resort for these assets. So I think that Besant has already solved for this. I just don't think that Paulson sees it that way, because Paulson is looking at, we need to have the traditional measures in place, which is the infusion of liquidity in order to shore up and create treasury demand. So he's operating from that 2008 great financial crisis playbook, which if you're a Bitcoiner, you're like, yeah, bring it on. Turn on the money printer. Keep printing money, because it's going to continue to just increase demand and interest in Bitcoin, debase the dollar, and expose it for what it is, which is just an endless money printer with no rational basis or support. If that happens, that could prove to be very good for Bitcoin, very bad for the dollar. So while we're in this really awkward pivot point, the closing of that piece I put out today is basically, what can you as the consumer do? Well, again, goes back to what I've talked about. If you believe that the dollar is in trouble, if you believe that this is unsustainable, if you think it's better to make your wallet your bank, and if you understand that you still have to spend in dollars to get things done in this world, as much as the Bitcoin purists believe that Bitcoin is a much better way of doing this, and I get it, I respect everything they're talking about, the reality is most consumers don't have Bitcoin, don't know how to spend Bitcoin at the point of sale. Most merchants don't know how to accept Bitcoin because it still needs time to be adopted. We live in a fiat world, and that fiat world is quickly moving digital. And if the Genius Act accomplishes what Besant and a lot of people think, which is a massive, in the trillions demand for treasuries, well, then that's going to be the primary way that money is going to move around the world. It's going to speed up the way you can move money between countries, the way you can pay vendors, the way you can pay employees, the way you can pay at the point of checkout, which again helps the merchant because the merchant doesn't have to eat those fees on credit card transactions. So it benefits everyone in a lot of ways. But the spending in sats, I should say, the spending in stables mantra that I talk about, it's not a long-term solution. It's not a strategy which I'm endorsing where you should trust in those digital dollars exclusively, because it doesn't solve the ultimate problem, which is the continued debasing of currency. And if we just print in infinity to keep getting ahead of our deficit, and we hope that we can, through digital dollars, create more demand for treasuries to give the dollar a longer runway, yeah, that creates a environment where stable coins make sense, but long term, you still have the same problem with the dollar. So that's why that two asset strategy, Bitcoin, again, this isn't financial advice, whatever two asset strategy you think will work for you, but having that two asset strategy as a hedge against the dollar's continued debasement is why I advocate for that spend in stables mantra. Stack in sats and make your wallet your bank, because by doing that, you break away from the banks and their moat on how you move your money. You move your money faster and cheaper, which benefits you as a consumer or a merchant. And then you have a strategy in place where you can then take those savings and hopefully build wealth in a way that protects you in the event that the dollar does indeed collapse. So, covered a good bit of ground today. 3 big points we took away from today's episode, and this will be available on podcast, and you can get this at Stablecoin Solutions on Apple and Spotify. Again, this is the first and only show where we talk exclusively about all this stuff, but the big takeaways from today is we're getting closer to the Clarity Act, but we're still having to wait for the senators to open up their kimono and show us what's in the draft language. They're apparently reluctant to do that because they don't want us to know too soon, because we might think about it and question it. So that bothers me, and I'll just continue to sound that alarm bell. Show us what's in the damn bill. Come on. Enough is enough. Secondly, we talked about this Circle freeze thing. The lawsuit's interesting, but I think at the end of the day, Circle probably wins on this because the legal precedent favors that there needs to be due process and there needs to be a legal mechanism in place before Circle can just get up and start freezing based on allegations or suspicion of fraud. While I know that's not fair for the fraud victims, that's the current mechanism that exists. It really matches the antiquated banking system mechanism, which is why I propose in the piece I put out earlier this week that we probably need some kind of hybrid approach where the courts are more nimble, the regulators are more nimble in issuing those legal authorities to freeze that Circle can then act on and have at least cover under the law in the event that they get sued for freezing those wallets. And then the third piece we talked about is the Paulson break glass in case of emergency strategy. I think Besson has already solved for that, and I'm curious to see how that unfolds. If you enjoyed this content and if you found value in it, please share this. Please share the live broadcast. Please replay it on podcast if you missed it. As always, I invite you to download my free guide if you want to understand more about how stablecoins can help you and your bottom line. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thanks for tuning in today. We'll do it again next Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern, the Stablecoin Solutions Show, brought to you by yours truly, Carlo. If you haven't followed me yet and you enjoy this content, give me a follow and download the book. What the hell do you have to lose besides an email address? I'm trying to build a community to help educate people to better understand how to adopt this technology for your own good. And I think that's an important thing for you to have in your radar. So again, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend, and we'll be back at it again real soon. Going to shut it down for today, and I'll catch you on the other side next Friday.